close your eyes. Imagine the year is 1943. The air in Philadelphia tastes of iron and coal dust. The shipyard is alive with hammering metal, the clang of steel on steel, the hiss of welding torches cutting through the night. America is at war, and every hour, the shipbuilders here know, could mean the difference between life and death for sailors far away on the Atlantic. But among the rows of destroyers, tankers, and cargo ships, there is one vessel that carries more whispers than orders, the USS Eldridge. Dock workers lean closer at the tavern. Sailors lower their voices when its name comes up. Some say the Navy is experimenting with a weapon that could change the war forever, something that would make a ship vanish from sight. Others dismiss it as drunken dockside gossip. And yet, the rumors refuse to die. Picture it, a warship shrouded in coils of humming machinery. A sudden glow, green, blue, almost alive. Men clutching the rails as the deck beneath them trembles, the air thick with ozone and static. Then, in an instant, silence. The Eldridge is gone. Some claim it reappeared hundreds of miles away in Norfolk, Virginia. Others swear they saw men fused into the bulkhead, screaming in horror. And still others insist the whole story is nothing more than an elaborate hoax. But here is the question that pulls us in. What really happened in Philadelphia in 1943? Was it a misunderstood scientific experiment in magnetism and radar stealth? A classified Navy project buried beneath decades of secrecy? Or something stranger? Something that defied the very laws of space and time? Tonight, we step into the shadows of history, where science and speculation blur, and where one wartime rumor became one of the most enduring legends of the 20th century. This is the story of the Philadelphia experiment. Chapter 1. Whispers on the Docks. Philadelphia in the early 1940s was never silent. Even when the city itself tried to sleep, the shipyard stayed awake, beating like the heart of a restless giant. Hammers struck steel with the rhythm of war drums. Rivets snapped into place with the sharp crack of gunfire. In the distance, a crane moaned under the weight of armor plating, lowering it into place with the trembling patience of a surgeon's hand. And everywhere there was the smell, thick and unshakable, the salt of the Delaware River, mixed with oil, coal smoke, sweat, and hot iron. It clung to your tongue like blood, heavy and metallic. War gave every city a smell. This was Philadelphia's. The naval yard had become one of the most vital engines of America's war machine. Ships rolled out like products from a conveyor belt, warships, escorts, tankers, all destined for the cold Atlantic, where German U-boats prowled like wolves. But among the vessels, there was one name whispered more than the others, one ship that seemed wrapped in shadows even as sparks lit up its steel frame. The USS Eldridge. At first, the rumors were faint, barely more than drunken talk at the bars just beyond the yard. A machinist swore he heard a low hum rising from the ship at night, though it wasn't even connected to the power lines. A welder insisted he'd seen a strange green glow ripple over its deck when the rest of the yard was dark. Sailors, assigned to her, muttered that this duty wasn't like the others, but they stopped short of explaining why. And then, in the smoke-filled taverns, the whispers grew fat. Men leaned closer, voices low, as though speaking of something forbidden. They're trying to make her invisible, one would say, eyes darting toward the door. Invisible? Hell, Next you'll tell me they've built planes that can dive underwater. No, listen. One night, the whole yard went silent. No lights, no sound. Then when it came back, the Eldridge was gone. Vanished. And after a few minutes, just like that, it was there again. Laughter followed, rough and uneasy. But the laughter always ended too quickly, collapsing into silence. Because in the marrow of wartime men, no rumor was too absurd to be possible. Governments pushed beyond reason in times like these. Desperation did strange things. Philadelphia itself was desperate. Families lived by ration books instead of grocery lists. Posters ordered people to save rubber, conserve fuel, recycle tin. Factories ran 24 hours a day. Men left for the front, women took their places on the lines, and every week new lists of the dead trickled back from the Atlantic. German submarines sank tankers and troop ships with terrifying ease. Radar was crude. Sonar imperfect. Convoys were bleeding. Everyone knew the Navy was hunting for solutions, and that meant trying things no one had dared before. So when whispers of invisibility spread, they didn't sound entirely ridiculous. In fact, in the fog of fear, they almost sounded believable. Some claimed to see more than lights. One dockhand said that from across the river, he watched the Eldridge shimmer, not like a reflection, but as if the very air around it was boiling. Its lines blurred, bending, and then the ship was simply whole again. Another said he saw men on deck moving strangely, their voices echoing as if slowed by some invisible weight. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe drink. Or maybe it was something else. What made the rumors impossible to kill was not proof, but the absence of proof. If someone claimed they saw the ship vanish, what could they show you? Nothing. But what could you show to prove it hadn't? Nothing either. In war, truth was as slippery as oil on the river, and just as hard to hold. That gap, that thin crack between the possible and the impossible, was all a rumor needed to grow. Imagine being a young sailor, freshly trained, stepping onto the Eldridge for the first time. The deck creaks beneath your boots. Coils of heavy cable snake across the floor. Machines sit covered by tarps, their shapes unrecognizable. Officers watch you with an intensity that says without words, "This ship is different." Would you sleep easily at night? Would you convince yourself it was all just another destroyer escort? Or would the whispers creep in, wrapping around your thoughts in the dark? The Philadelphia experiment, as it would later be known, didn't start in laboratories or inside secret files. It began here, in the bars and on the docks, in the nervous voices of men who had seen too much war to dismiss the impossible outright. This was the soil where the legend took root, a city pulsing with fire and industry, a navy grasping for miracles, and a ship that seemed just a little too strange. And so the whispers continued, spreading from tavern to tavern, from deck to deck. The Eldridge was no longer just a ship. It was a ghost waiting to be born. By nightfall, when smoke still curled above the furnaces and the Delaware glowed with the light of burning steel, a question lingered in the air, like fog over water. What if the Navy really had tried to make a ship disappear? No one on the docks could answer. The officers behind closed doors wouldn't say. But the whispers, those restless, stubborn whispers, refused to die. And that is where the story begins. Chapter 2. The War Machine's Desperation. The war had swallowed the world whole. By 1943, every factory, Every dock, every train station seemed to pulse with urgency. The United States was fighting on two oceans now, Japan in the Pacific, Germany in the Atlantic, and every ton of steel leaving Philadelphia felt like another artery opened to feed the hungry war. German U-boats had turned the Atlantic into a hunting ground. They stalked the dark waters like wolves, and the sailors knew it. The moment a convoy slipped past the safety of the American coast, the night became thick with dread. Torpedoes struck without warning. Ships that had carried wheat, oil, and ammunition disappeared in boiling plumes of fire and salt water. Survivors sometimes bobbed for hours on wreckage, their faces lit by the burning oil slicks of their own tankers. Every week, the newspapers printed lists of the dead. Every week, mothers in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New Jersey wept over telegrams, edged in black. In that climate of desperation, new ideas were treated not as wild theories, but as possible lifelines. And somewhere in the upper echelons of the Navy, someone must have asked the forbidden question, what if a ship could not be seen at all? Invisible, untouchable, beyond the gaze of periscopes and radar. It was madness, of course, or at least it should have been. But war bends reason. It warps judgment. And when survival is measured in weeks, nothing seems too far-fetched to try. The Navy had already been experimenting with magnetic fields to protect ships from mines. The degaussing process involved running heavy cables around a vessel's hull and charging them with electricity to disrupt the magnetic signature that triggered explosives. Most sailors accepted this as standard procedure. But on the Eldridge, something looked different. The coils seemed thicker, the arrangements strange. Dockhands swore that the engineers brought aboard equipment unlike anything they'd seen before: tall generators, experimental instruments covered with canvas tarps. At night, when the rest of the yard glowed only with the steady orange of furnace fires, men claimed the Eldridge sometimes pulsed with an unnatural light. Green, bluish, shimmering like heat haze rising from asphalt. The air itself seemed to grow heavy near her hull, buzzing faintly with static. One welder joked nervously that you could light a cigarette just by standing too close to her deck rails. The science they whispered about had names attached to it. Nikola Tesla, eccentric, brilliant, long dead by then, but remembered for his wild visions of wireless energy and impossible machines. Albert Einstein, living, breathing, a man who spoke of equations that no one else could fully grasp. His unified field theory, an unfinished dream, was said to hint that gravity and electromagnetism might be woven into the same fabric. What if someone had taken those half-born ideas and forced them into practice? What if the Navy had tried to bend the laws of nature, not in a laboratory, but on the deck of a warship? Of course, these were only rumors. No one in the shipyard saw Einstein pacing the docks, and Tesla had died alone in a New York hotel months earlier. But sailors are masters of weaving science into superstition. They stitched together scraps of truth with long threads of imagination, and soon the story took on a life of its own. In the taverns beyond the shipyard gates, where the smell of whiskey mixed with coal smoke, the whispers thickened. The whole yard went dark one night. A machinist muttered. When the lights came back, she wasn't there. Just gone. Then, bam, like nothing happened, she was back. Another leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper over the clink of glasses. You know what they're saying? She didn't just vanish from the dock. She moved, appeared down in Norfolk for a few minutes, then came back. The men listening would laugh nervously, but not for long. Their laughter always dissolved into uneasy silence, because desperate governments did desperate things, and no one really knew what was happening behind the locked bulkheads of the Eldridge. For the sailors assigned to her, the unease was heavier. A young man from Boston wrote in a letter to his sister, "This ship isn't right. When we drill, the air feels wrong. Sometimes I swear my eyes can't focus on the lines of the deck. But if I said that out loud, they'd put me in the brig." Another sailor refused to sleep in his bunk below deck, claiming he heard the hum of engines even when the power was off. Were these men exhausted? Paranoid? Or had they seen something that logic alone couldn't explain? The desperation of 1943 gave weight to their words. If you were a sailor about to face the Atlantic, haunted by the shadow of submarines, wouldn't you cling to the possibility that your ship might simply vanish from enemy sight? Hope, however irrational, was a powerful drug. And once planted, it spread through the ranks like fire through dry grass. By summer, the Eldridge was no longer simply a destroyer escort. To those who saw her rise and fall in the river's mist, she was a question wrapped in steel, a promise, or a threat. Perhaps even a weapon too dangerous for the men meant to wield it. And in the darkest corners of the shipyard bars, one question began to circle over and over, whispered by men who lowered their voices each time they said it. What if it's true? Chapter 3: Tesla's Ghost and Einstein's Shadow. By the summer of 1943, the rumors circling the USS Eldridge had grown teeth. Men no longer whispered just of a hum in the air or a shimmer along the deck. They spoke of science dark, forbidden science dragged out of ivory towers and laboratories and bolted onto the steel spine of a warship. The names that surfaced in these whispers were names already half myth in the public imagination. Nikola Tesla. Albert Einstein. 1. The eccentric wizard who had promised lightning in a bottle, who had dreamed of transmitting energy through the air itself. The other, the quiet genius who had bent the universe with his equations, revealing that space and time were not absolutes, but fabric to be curved and shaped. Tesla was already gone, having died alone in a New York hotel earlier that same year. When the maid found him, in January 1943, his room was littered with notes, diagrams, strange devices no one could quite identify. The government arrived swiftly. The FBI seized boxes of his papers under the official explanation of national security. To most, it was another odd chapter in the story of a brilliant but unstable man. To those at the Philadelphia docks, it was fuel for a darker suspicion that Tesla's final unfinished experiments had not died with him, that the Navy had stolen them, carried them across the Hudson, and grafted them onto the Eldridge. Einstein, on the other hand, was still alive, his soft German accent echoing in lecture halls, his chalk still scratching across blackboards. But in wartime America, Einstein was more than a professor. He was the prophet of the atomic age. His letter to Roosevelt in 1939 had helped set the Manhattan Project in motion. If Einstein had urged the creation of the bomb, why couldn't he also have whispered advice about bending light around a ship, twisting magnetic fields to shield steel from sight. Even the vaguest mention of his unified field theory, a half-formed idea that gravity and electromagnetism might be united in a single equation, was enough to spark the imagination. Picture yourself as a sailor, half drunk in a smoky bar, listening to a machinist spin the tale. They've got Tesla's papers. The old man figured out how to bend electricity, make it dance. And Einstein, he gave them the math. They're building it into the Eldridge, right under our noses. A pause. A gulp of beer. A nervous laugh. And you know what that means? The ship won't just hide from radar. She'll vanish. Right out of this world. No one in the bar believed it entirely, not with their sober minds. And yet, no one dismissed it completely either, because they knew the times they were living in. The Manhattan Project was already proof that unthinkable things could become real. A single bomb, powerful enough to erase a city, was being designed in the desert as they spoke. Radar had gone from a laboratory curiosity to a battlefield necessity in less than a decade. The sky itself had filled with machines heavier than air, dropping fire on cities thousands of miles away. Was invisibility so much stranger? Teleportation so much more absurd? The line between science and magic was blurring, and men at war no longer cared which side of the line salvation came from. In the shipyard, small details deepened the mystery. Men described thick bundles of cable running in unnatural patterns along the Eldridge's hull. Strange devices, heavy with copper coils, lowered into her belly and covered with tarps. Engineers working through the night, their conversations clipped, their blueprints rolled away when others walked past. Even the air seemed charged around her, like the stillness before lightning strikes. A dockhand later recalled that, when he leaned against the ship's railing, his arm hair stood on end as if touched by static. "I could taste metal in the back of my mouth," he said, "like biting down on a penny." Another insisted he once saw a man walk past the ship and vanish behind a shimmer in the air, though his friends teased him for drinking too much that night. It didn't matter if the details were true. What mattered was that they fit the story. Tesla's ghost, Einstein's equations, coils of humming machinery, they were puzzle pieces that snapped together neatly in the imaginations of desperate men. And so, when sailors lay in their bunks at night, listening to the creak of steel and the distant hiss of welding torches, some swore they felt the Eldridge breathing. Not like a ship, but like a living thing, humming with secrets. They told themselves it was impossible. They told themselves it was just nerves. But in their dreams, the ship glowed green and slipped away into the dark. It is easy, looking back, to dismiss such stories as superstition. To laugh at the idea of invisibility, of teleportation, of science conjuring magic on a battlefield. But remember the world these men lived in. Cities were burning in Europe and Asia. Death rained from the sky nightly. Scientists were splitting the atom. The impossible was happening everywhere, and so the impossible became believable. Tesla's ghost haunted the machinery. Einstein's shadow fell across the decks, and the men of Philadelphia dockworkers, sailors, welders, officers were left to wonder whether the Eldridge was truly a destroyer escort or the first vessel of another world. Chapter 4. The experiment begins. The morning of the test began like any other. At least, that was what the officers told the crew. Routine. Another drill. Another day on the Eldridge. Yet every man aboard could feel something different in the air. The ship had been fitted with strange coils of cable, wound tight around the hull, and fed into humming generators below deck. Heavy machinery, wrapped in tarps, had been installed in secret compartments, and technicians men sailors didn't recognize moved about with clipboards and steely silence. Some wore naval uniforms, but others looked like civilians, scientists with sharp eyes and ink-stained fingers, men who never seemed to sleep. The order came to prepare for electromagnetic degaussing, a phrase that sounded technical enough to be believable, but vague enough to hide its true purpose. Officially, it was a test to make the ship less visible to magnetic minds. Unofficially, the men had already heard the whispers. By midday, the sky over the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard was heavy and gray, the kind of sky that pressed down like a lid, trapping every sound. The water of the Delaware River lapped against the hull, dark and restless. A light wind carried the scent of oil and smoke across the decks. Inside the Eldridge, sailors stood at their stations. Some tried to joke, their laughter thin and forced. Others crossed themselves quietly, their lips moving with prayers they hoped no one would notice. The hum of the machinery below was louder than usual, a low vibration that seemed to crawl up through the steel plates and into their bones. Engage the field. The order was given with clinical calm, but the effect was anything but ordinary. The coils crackled to life. A surge of electricity roared through the ship, rattling the bulkheads and making the air vibrate. The smell of ozone, sharp, metallic, like lightning on a summer night, filled every corridor. A greenish haze began to shimmer around the edges of the vessel, at first faint, then growing brighter, until it wrapped the entire ship in a halo of ghostly light. Men clutched the rails, as the deck seemed to tremble under their boots. Compasses spun wildly. Watches froze. Radios screamed with static. The air thickened, charged, pressing against their lungs like invisible hands. And then, silence. From the dockside, witnesses claimed the Eldridge began to blur. Its sharp lines wavered, bending like heat rising off desert sand. For a moment, the ship seemed transparent, as though its steel hull were no more substantial than smoke. Then, in a flash of blue-white light, it was gone. Gone. The water where it had floated only moments before rolled back in waves, then settled into emptiness. Dock workers stared in disbelief. Men dropped their tools. One swore he felt the ground itself shudder, as though something vast had been ripped from the world. For several seconds, some claimed minutes, the Eldridge simply did not exist. And then, just as suddenly, it returned. It was not a graceful reappearance. The ship slammed back into reality with a thunderous crack, as though the river itself resisted its return. Smoke poured from its deck. The once glowing halo sputtered and died. Instruments flickered erratically, lights dimmed, then steadied. At first, it seemed the ship had survived. The steel was intact, the hull unbroken. But the men were not the same. Some staggered across the deck, vomiting, their faces pale and twisted with nausea. Others clutched at their heads, screaming, their voices raw with terror. A few stared blankly into space, their eyes wide, as if looking at something no one else could see. And then there were the others, the ones who had not returned whole. Witnesses later whispered of sailors who had fused with the ship itself, arms buried in bulkheads, legs trapped in steel, their screams muffled by iron. One man was said to have melted halfway into the deck, his body still twitching as though alive. Another was found embedded in a wall, his face frozen in silent agony. Whether these accounts were exaggeration or truth remains uncertain, but the image lingers, men welded to the very vessel that had betrayed them. Even those who appeared unharmed were not untouched. Some wandered the deck in a daze, unable to recognize their own shipmates. Others claimed to slip in and out of sight, vanishing for seconds at a time, as though reality had not fully claimed them back. Panic rippled through the crew. The officers barked orders, desperate to restore control, but their own hands shook. Below deck, engineers frantically shut down the machinery, the smell of burning insulation thick in the air. Slowly, painfully, the humming ceased. The coils went dark. The haze dissolved. The Eldridge sat once again in the Delaware River, looking for all the world like any other destroyer escort. But the men who had seen what happened knew it was no ordinary ship. And the men who had felt what happened would never forget it. Back on the docks, no one could explain what they had witnessed. Some swore the ship had disappeared only for seconds. Others insisted it was gone for minutes, maybe longer. A few whispered that it had not vanished at all, but teleported to Norfolk, Virginia, hundreds of miles away, before returning in an instant. How could that be? How could steel and men slip through space like ghosts? No answer came. The Navy said nothing. The sailors said less. And yet, in the weeks that followed, the whispers spread like wildfire. In the taverns, on the docks, even in the letters home written in shaky, censored handwriting, the story took on shape and weight. A ship had vanished. A ship had returned. And its crew had paid the price. Chapter 5. Vanishing Acts at Sea. If the first test in Philadelphia was strange, what came next pushed the story beyond the boundaries of war and deep into the realm of legend. The whispers claimed that the Eldridge didn't just vanish from the dock. She moved. One moment, she was anchored in the Delaware River. The next, she appeared in Norfolk, Virginia, over 200 miles away. Sailors there supposedly saw her materialize in a sudden, blinding haze, only to disappear again minutes later. By the time the stunned witnesses could blink the salt from their eyes, she was gone. And in Philadelphia, as if stitched by invisible thread, she returned. Could a ship truly leap through space like that, tearing itself from one harbor and dropping into another? The idea was outrageous. And yet, as the story spread, it hardened into detail. Men swore they had seen her hull shimmer like a mirage, then vanish. Others insisted they spoke to sailors in Norfolk, who described the ship appearing out of thin air, her deck awash in blue light. Of course, official records say nothing of this. No logs, no radio traffic, no officer reports describe the Eldridge's alleged voyage across the coast. But rumors don't need records. They need only voices, and the voices would not be silenced. What made the tale more terrifying were the stories of the crew. Some, it was said, never came back at all. They were there one moment and gone the next, swallowed by whatever force had ripped the ship from the dock. Others reappeared, but not unchanged. Witnesses spoke of men stumbling across the deck, confused, unable to speak their names. Some wandered into town, dazed, not recognizing their families. A few were said to vanish days later, slipping into thin air as though they had never truly returned. One account, perhaps the most haunting, described a group of sailors who gathered in a bar after the experiment. They sat together at a table, drinking quietly, when one of them began to fade. Not all at once, but slowly, his outline dissolving, until his friends grabbed hold of him in panic. They clutched his arms, his shoulders, desperate to anchor him to the world. But he slipped away, leaving only empty air where a man had been. His shipmates screamed for help, but by the time anyone else looked, the seat was empty. Exaggeration? Hallucination? Alcohol-fueled delusion? Perhaps. And yet the story spread, repeated in hushed tones, embroidered with every telling, until it became unshakable. Even those who survived intact were said to suffer. Some complained of headaches so severe they drove men mad. Others claimed their memories fractured, days lost as if cut from film. A few spoke of voices, whispers in the dark, calling from nowhere. One sailor reportedly begged to be locked in his bunk at night, terrified he would disappear in his sleep. Then there were the bodies. The most grotesque accounts described men fused with the ship itself, as if the steel and flesh had mingled in some grotesque union. A hand protruding from a bulkhead. A face half submerged in the deck. Legs embedded in steel, twitching uselessly. The image was so horrifying that even those who doubted the story couldn't quite forget it. The Navy, naturally, said nothing. Silence was its shield. Sailors who spoke too freely were allegedly transferred, locked away in psychiatric wards, or simply disappeared from records. And so the legend filled the void. Imagine being a dock worker, hearing these tales secondhand. You would glance across the river at the Eldridge with new eyes, seeing not a ship but a ghost. Imagine being a sailor ordered aboard her, your boots echoing on the deck where men had supposedly melted into steel. Would you obey without fear? Or would every hum of machinery, every flicker of light, make you wonder if you were next? What truly happened may never be known. Perhaps the experiment was only an attempt at radar camouflage, a field meant to deflect waves, misunderstood by those who witnessed it. Perhaps nothing unusual happened at all, and the stories were born from boredom, drink, and imagination. But legends do not need truth to survive. They need only mystery. And in Philadelphia, in Norfolk, and across the Navy itself, the mystery grew until the Eldridge was no longer just a ship. She was a myth set afloat on dark waters. And as myths often do, hers carried a warning that some experiments should never be tried because the price is not paid in steel or fire, but in the minds and bodies of the men who are asked to serve. The Eldridge sailed again after that day. She crossed the Atlantic, escorted convoys, did her duty like any other destroyer escort. But the men who looked at her from the docks whispered of the time she had vanished and wondered whether she was truly all there, whether some part of her still floated in another place, unseen, waiting. The story would not die, and the sailors who lived it, some never spoke again. Some drank themselves into silence, and a few, broken by what they had seen, began to write. Chapter 6. The Aftermath Nobody Wanted. The Eldridge sat quietly at her berth in the weeks that followed, her gray hull reflecting the sluggish waters of the Delaware. To the casual eye, she was nothing unusual, another warship among dozens, her deck scrubbed clean, her officers moving with crisp efficiency. But to those who had seen, or thought they had seen, what happened that summer, the Eldridge was no longer a ship. She was a secret wrapped in steel. The Navy said nothing. There were no press releases, no official reports. The incident, whatever it had been, was swallowed whole by silence. In wartime, silence was easier than explanation. Men were shipped off, reassigned, dispersed like dust in the wind. And those who had witnessed too much were encouraged, firmly, to forget. But forgetting was impossible. The whispers spread faster than silence could contain them. In bars along the waterfront, men leaned close over their glasses of whiskey. They spoke of sailors gone mad, raving about glowing light and vanishing decks. They spoke of men transferred suddenly to psychiatric wards, their names scrubbed from rosters. One rumor insisted that a handful of sailors were confined to a naval hospital in Bethesda, their minds shattered, their bodies trembling as though still vibrating from the experiment. Others told darker tales. Sailors, who had survived the ordeal, supposedly carried scars no doctor could explain, patches of skin that shimmered oddly in the light, hands that trembled uncontrollably, eyes that seemed to lose focus at random. Some were said to drift in and out of sight, fading like ghosts before snapping back into reality. They called them the Lost Ones. One voice whispered in a tavern, because you never knew if they were all here or half somewhere else. The Navy dismissed all of this as nonsense. Officially, the Eldridge performed her duties without incident. She sailed in convoys. She chased submarines. She earned her battle stars like any other ship. To ask questions was to invite trouble. Officers grew cold, their smiles thin, when the topic surfaced. Men who pressed too hard were reminded of the Espionage Act, of the penalties for loose tongues. The war had no patience for sailors with wild stories. But silence has its own way of amplifying rumors. For the families of those who served on the Eldridge, the letters were strange. A mother in Ohio received a note from her son that read, "Do not ask me what we are doing. Just pray for me. Something is wrong here." Weeks later, another letter arrived, written in the same hand but with a tone so distant she wondered if it was truly him. A wife in Boston opened a telegram informing her that her husband had been reassigned after medical complications. When she traveled to see him, she found a hollow-eyed man who could barely remember her name. The Navy explained nothing. Doctors said words like battle fatigue and psychological trauma, but the wives and mothers knew. These were not the wounds of combat. Something else had happened. Back at the Philadelphia docks, the legend grew in the telling. Dock workers claimed they had seen the ship vanish with their own eyes. Some swore they saw her reappear dripping with condensation, as though she had been plunged into ice water. Others claimed they had spoken to men in Norfolk who confirmed it. The Eldridge had been there, if only for minutes, glowing like a phantom. Still others whispered of cover-ups. One story claimed that entire sections of logbooks had been cut out with razors, leaving blank gaps where the dates of the experiment should have been. Another insisted that an officer who had spoken too freely was transferred overnight and never seen again. And always there were the darker tales, the ones told only after enough drinks had loosened tongues. Stories of men fused with bulkheads, of sailors who walked into a steel wall and never walked out, of bodies that had to be cut free from the deck itself. Perhaps these were exaggerations, born of fear and imagination. Perhaps not. But even if the details blurred, the horror remained. The Navy could deny all it liked, but denial only sharpened curiosity. The absence of truth became fertile ground for legend. And so the Philadelphia experiment became more than a rumor. It became a ghost that haunted the shipyards, a story that grew stronger the harder men tried to silence it. Imagine walking past the Eldridge in those days, her gray hull gleaming in the sun, her deck alive with ordinary activity. Sailors polishing brass, officers calling out drills. To the casual eye, nothing unusual at all. Yet in the back of your mind, the whispers echoed, "That ship vanished. That ship killed its own men. That ship has walked places no vessel should go." The Navy wanted the story buried. The men wanted the story forgotten. But the story had already escaped, and once a story escapes, it cannot be brought back. The Philadelphia experiment had begun to take on a life of its own. And soon, it would find its first public voice, one that would carry it beyond the bars and docks, into the pages of books, and eventually into the imagination of the world. Chapter 7. The Witnesses Speak. For years, the Philadelphia experiment lived only in the dark corners of dockside taverns and hushed conversations between sailors. It was a ghost story with no name, passed hand to hand, like contraband. But every story, if it survives long enough, eventually finds a voice loud enough to carry it into the light. That voice belonged to a drifter named Carl Meredith Allen, though he often called himself by another name, Carlos Miguel Allende. Allen was not an officer, nor a scientist, nor even a reliable narrator. He was a sailor of the merchant marine, restless and eccentric, the sort of man who scribbled notes in the margins of books and carried strange stories like cargo. In 1955, more than a decade after the supposed events in Philadelphia, Allen stumbled across a work that set his imagination ablaze, a book by astronomer Morris K. Jessup, titled The Case for the UFO. Jessup was not a crackpot. He was an academic, trained in astronomy, fascinated by unexplained phenomena. In his book, he speculated about the possibility of advanced propulsion systems, anti-gravity, warp drives, the sort of ideas that would one day be the lifeblood of science fiction. Jessup's writing was cautious, thoughtful. But for Allen, it was an open invitation. When Allen read Jessup's musings about the manipulation of gravity and electromagnetic fields, he saw a perfect mirror of the whispers he had heard in Philadelphia years before. And so he began to write. The letters he sent to Jessup were rambling, breathless, filled with half-mad detail. He claimed that he had witnessed the Navy's experiment firsthand, that he had seen the Eldridge shimmer, vanish, and reappear, that sailors had suffered grotesque fates, some fused with steel, some driven insane, some lost in ways too strange to describe. Men were lost, Allen wrote, his words feverish. Lost in the nothing. They were gone. But the ship returned. He spoke of Einstein's unified field theory, of Tesla's ghostly influence, of technology meant to win a war but too dangerous to ever reveal. He claimed the Navy had silenced witnesses, hidden the survivors, buried the truth. Jessup, at first, dismissed the letters as the work of a disturbed mind. And perhaps they were. Allen's handwriting looped erratically. His thoughts tumbled over each other in chaotic waves. But Jessup could not entirely ignore them. The detail was too specific, the conviction too strong. He responded cautiously, probing for clarity. Allen wrote back, weaving more of his story into the fabric of myth. Then something strange happened. Jessup's book, annotated with Allen's scribbles, began to circulate in naval circles. According to later accounts, the Office of Naval Research received a copy filled with 3 sets of handwriting supposedly Allen's, though he denied it. The notes expanded on Jessup's ideas, linking them directly to the Philadelphia experiment, as though the margins themselves had become the birthplace of conspiracy. The Navy, officially, dismissed the whole affair. But the very fact that officials had examined the annotated book gave the legend oxygen. If there was nothing to the story, why would the Navy care? Why would they even bother reading it? Jessup, meanwhile, found himself trapped. His cautious scientific reputation was now shackled to Allen's fevered claims. He gave lectures, wrote follow-ups, tried to defend his credibility. But the shadow of the Philadelphia experiment clung to him. In 1959, overwhelmed by personal and professional struggles, Jessup was found dead in his car, an apparent suicide. For believers, his death was proof. For skeptics, it was tragedy twisted into myth. Allen, of course, drifted on. He surfaced in letters, in interviews, always slippery, always half in character. Sometimes he insisted the story was true. Sometimes he wavered, hinting it was an elaborate hoax. But by then, it no longer mattered what Allen believed. The story had escaped him, just as it had escaped the sailors in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia experiment was no longer a whisper on the docks. It was ink on paper, words in books, speculation in lecture halls. It had become part of the cultural bloodstream. And perhaps the most haunting part was this: the story had begun with a single man's letters, scribbled in the margins of a book. Words that might have been ignored, dismissed, forgotten. Instead, they had cracked open a mystery that refuses to close, even decades later. The witnesses had spoken. Or at least, one had. And from his words, a legend was born. Chapter 8. Science or Science Fiction. By the late 1950s, the Philadelphia experiment had already taken on the texture of myth. Sailors spoke of it in hushed tones, conspiracy writers embraced it, and believers swore it was the hidden key to technologies we could barely imagine. But behind the drama and horror lay a simple question: was any of it possible? At first glance, the idea of making a ship invisible seems like something from the pages of a pulp magazine, the kind sold for a dime, with lurid covers of ray guns and monsters. And yet, the U.S. Navy in the 1940s really had been experimenting with ways to make ships less detectable, not by magic, but by physics. One of these methods was called degaussing. Mines during the war were triggered not just by contact, but by the magnetic field of a ship's steel hull. By running heavy electric cables around the hull and pulsing them with current, engineers could cancel out the ship's magnetic signature. It was practical, simple, and widely used. But to an untrained observer, seeing men wrap a ship in thick coils of cable and fire up generators might look like something far more sinister. Radar camouflage was another real possibility. Radar, still in its infancy during WWII, sent out radio waves that bounced back when they struck metal. If a ship could scatter or absorb those waves, it might appear smaller or even invisible on an enemy screen. Experiments with special coatings, chaff aluminum strips, and electromagnetic tricks were all underway. Again, these were grounded in reality. But to a sailor watching strange equipment being bolted onto his ship under tarps, the effect might seem otherworldly. And then there was the science that sat on the edge of plausibility. Electromagnetic fields, strong enough to bend light. Could such things exist? Theoretically, extreme manipulation of gravity and electromagnetism could warp space itself, bending light around an object and hiding it. Today, we call this cloaking or metamaterials, but in the 1940s, such ideas lived only in equations and dreams. Einstein's unified field theory, often invoked in the story, was real but unfinished, speculative, and nowhere near the practical blueprint that rumor painted it to be. Tesla's experiments with wireless power and resonance were brilliant but incomplete. Could scraps of these theories have been misinterpreted, exaggerated, twisted into a wartime legend? Almost certainly. But the darker details of the Philadelphia experiment, the teleportation, the sailors fused with steel, the men fading from sight, pushed the story beyond the realm of physics and into something else entirely. Science can explain the coils of wire. Science can explain radar camouflage. But science struggles to explain a man embedded in a bulkhead, his screams muffled by iron. And yet, perhaps that is why the story endures. Because it balances on a knife's edge between the plausible and the impossible, between what science was doing in secret laboratories and what sailors thought they saw in the haze of smoke, fear, and electricity. Ask yourself, if you were a dock worker in 1943 watching a destroyer wrapped in cables glow with blue light, would you think of degaussing? Or would you think of invisibility? If you heard that the Navy was working on radar stealth, would you imagine equations and wavelengths, or a ship that could vanish into thin air? The Philadelphia experiment survives because it lives in that gap between science and science fiction. Too real to dismiss, too strange to believe. And perhaps that is its greatest power, not whether it happened, but that it could have happened in some form, hidden by secrecy, misunderstood by witnesses, magnified by rumor. The Navy has always denied it, of course. There was no invisibility experiment, the records say. The Eldridge was never in Philadelphia when claimed. There was no teleportation. Yet those denials feel thin against the weight of decades of whispers. Denial fuels belief. Silence breeds speculation. And so, even now, when cloaking devices and quantum theories sit at the edge of our science, the Philadelphia experiment feels less like a wild fantasy and more like a dark foreshadowing. A reminder that what begins as rumor can one day become reality. The line between science and science fiction is thin, and in the heat of war, perhaps it vanished entirely. Chapter 9. The Price of Curiosity. Every great myth is more than machines and theories. It is flesh and blood, men and women, fear and loss. The Philadelphia experiment was no different. If ships truly shimmered and vanished, it was the sailors who bore the burden. The stories that trickled out in the aftermath were not of triumphant breakthroughs or scientific marvels. They were stories of shattered minds, broken bodies, and families left with questions they could never ask out loud. Some sailors, it was whispered, never fully came back. Their bodies returned, but their minds drifted like men stranded halfway between this world and another. A machinist supposedly found one shipmate curled in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, repeating the same words over and over. The light, the light, the light. He did not stop until they carried him away. Others complained of sudden blackouts, moments when their vision tunneled and the world dissolved. A boatswain's mate later told a friend that sometimes he'd be walking across the deck, and the men around him would gasp, not because of what he did, but because of what they didn't see. For a few heartbeats, they swore, he simply wasn't there. Then, as quickly as he vanished, he returned, wide-eyed and trembling, his body slick with sweat. Imagine the terror of living like that, of never knowing whether you might dissolve into air in front of your comrades. The sailors called it getting stuck. They told stories of men who would freeze mid-step, eyes glassy, bodies rigid, as if paralyzed. Others rushed to their aid, shaking them, slapping them, desperately trying to pull them back. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the tales claimed it did not. And the worst of these stories were the ones whispered in darkness, men who faded entirely, their bodies dissolving before their friends' eyes, leaving only empty boots behind. Were these hallucinations, embellishments, madness, or something darker? The Navy never explained. Those who exhibited such symptoms were quietly transferred, their records sealed, their families told only that they had suffered nervous breakdowns or battle fatigue. A polite way of saying, do not ask questions. For the wives and mothers, the confusion was unbearable. Letters arrived, written in shaky, uneven hands. Some carried words that made no sense at all, strings of phrases that seemed scrambled, as if the writer's thoughts had been scattered like leaves in a storm. Others carried desperate pleas. Get me off this ship. Something is wrong. Please. A wife in Virginia recalled the last time she saw her husband. He had been home on leave, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from his coffee. When she touched his hand, he flinched, as though burned. It doesn't feel real anymore, he whispered. Nothing feels real. A week later, she received word that he had been reassigned. She never heard from him again. Another story, often repeated in the bars, told of a group of sailors drinking in a Norfolk tavern. They laughed, they argued, they played cards. Then, in the middle of a hand, one man began to fade. His skin grew translucent, his body dissolving like mist. His friends leapt up, grabbing him, trying to pin him to the floor, to keep him anchored in reality. But the more they held him, the more insubstantial he became, until at last their arms clutched nothing but air. His beer still sat on the table, his cards still in his hand, but the man himself was gone. The bartender swore he saw it. The sailors swore it happened. The Navy, of course, said nothing. For the men who remained, there were scars, if not on the skin, then deep in the mind. Nightmares of being trapped inside steel, unable to breathe. Flashes of green light that haunted their sleep. The dread of standing on deck and feeling the air vibrate, fearing that, at any moment, the world might tear open again. Some sought escape in drink, stumbling through the docks with hollow eyes. Others simply disappeared into hospitals, committed under vague diagnoses of schizophrenia or hallucinations. Families were told little more than, "He won't be coming home." And yet, despite the tragedy, the experiment pressed forward if it had truly existed at all. That is the cruel heart of the Philadelphia legend. Even if half the tales were embellishment, even if most were the madness of rumor, there may still have been men who paid with their sanity, their lives, for curiosity forced too far. Every scientific gamble has a price. But this one, if the whispers were true, was not paid in equations or machinery. It was paid in sailors, ordinary men asked to stand on the deck of a ship while forces beyond comprehension tore at their flesh and their minds. And that is why the Philadelphia experiment endures. Not because of equations or theories, but because of the human cost it suggests. The story of men who were broken by something they could not name, silenced by a government that could not explain, and remembered only in whispers that refused to die. The question lingers, like smoke after a fire. How much suffering is hidden behind the walls of secrecy? And how many lives can be shattered in the pursuit of impossible dreams? Chapter 10. Myths that refuse to sink. Legends are like ships. Some are built deliberately, hammered from planks of truth and steel beams of fact. Others, like the Philadelphia experiment, drift out of the fog unbidden, patched together from rumor and stitched with fear, yet somehow they stay afloat decade after decade. By the 1960s, the whispers that began in dockside taverns had escaped into the wider world. They had been carried by sailors who couldn't stay silent, amplified by Carlos Allende's strange letters, and haunted by the tragic story of Morris Jessup, the scientist who listened. Now, they began to ripple outward into books, magazines, and eventually onto screens. The story grew with each retelling. In one version, the Eldridge didn't just vanish for minutes, but for hours. In another, she reappeared in Norfolk in front of dozens of witnesses who swore on their lives they saw her there. Some versions claimed the crew had been driven mad by the experiment. Others spoke of men melted into bulkheads, their screams echoing through steel. Each telling added details the last lacked, like barnacles clinging to a hull, and together they transformed rumor into mythology. In smoky living rooms, amateur researchers debated the science. Could Einstein's unified field theory really bend light? Was Tesla's death ray actually a cloaking device? Every scrap of wartime secrecy fed the fire. The Navy's refusal to comment, its silence heavy and immovable, seemed to many like the surest proof of all. After all, why deny something so loudly if it had never happened? The Philadelphia experiment became a story told not just by sailors, but by novelists, journalists, conspiracy theorists. In the 1970s, a book titled The Philadelphia Experiment Project Invisibility by William Moore and Charles Berlitz brought the tale to a mass audience. Berlitz was already famous for the Bermuda Triangle, and his touch turned the experiment into a sibling legend of vanishing ships and impossible science. Suddenly, the Eldridge was no longer just a rumor from World War II, it was a global mystery. And then came Hollywood. In 1984, the film The Philadelphia Experiment hit theaters. It told the story of two sailors flung forward through time when their ship disappeared in 1943. The movie was pure fantasy romance, adventure, special effects, but it cemented the experiment in the popular imagination. Millions of people who had never heard of the Eldridge now carried the story with them, half believing, half dismissing, but always curious. Even in later years, the myth refused to sink. It appeared in television documentaries, in comic books, in late-night radio shows where callers whispered their theories into the dark. Some connected it to UFOs, claiming the same technology was used at Roswell. Others insisted it was tied to Montauk, to time travel, to secret experiments that spanned decades. The Philadelphia experiment became less about one ship and more about the fear that somewhere, someone was tearing holes in the fabric of reality. But beneath the spectacle, there was something quieter, something more haunting. Because at its core, the Philadelphia experiment is not about technology, it is about men. Men who might have suffered, who might have been silenced, who might have vanished into history without a name. Families who never knew the truth. Sailors who carried scars that no one explained. That is why the myth endures. It refuses to sink because it speaks to something deeper than ships and science. It speaks to the fear of secrets, the terror of experiments hidden behind locked doors, the uneasy suspicion that governments know more than they admit. It is a legend born of war, of desperation, of curiosity that reached too far. Even today, if you walk the streets of Philadelphia and ask about the old naval yard, someone will tell you the story. Maybe with a grin, maybe with a whisper, maybe with a shake of the head. But they will tell it. Because stories like this don't die. They linger, like the taste of smoke in the air, like the hum of electricity after a storm. And in the imagination of those who hear it, the Eldridge still glows green, still hums with power, still vanishes into the mist, only to return, scarred, haunted, unforgettable. The Philadelphia experiment has become more than an event. It is a question without an answer, a mystery without a grave, a ship that refuses to sink. Chapter 11. Declassified Shadows. The official record is as cold and gray as naval steel. According to the U.S. Navy, the Philadelphia experiment never happened. The Eldridge, they insist, was never even in Philadelphia at the time the experiment supposedly took place. She was in New York, in the Bahamas, escorting convoys. Her logs are clear, her orders precise. Nothing unusual, nothing mysterious. But silence is never as empty as it seems. When Carlos Allende's letters surfaced and Jessup's tragic story spread, curiosity seekers began pressing harder. In the 1960s and 70s, Freedom of Information Act requests trickled in, hungry for confirmation. Boxes of documents were declassified technical reports, correspondence, wartime orders. None contained proof of invisibility. None spoke of teleportation. Most were dull as dust, requisitions for parts, maintenance schedules, convoy escorts, And yet, for believers, this was no exoneration. This was the cover-up. Because secrecy is its own form of proof. When governments release nothing but tedium, the absence itself becomes suspicious. Why? The believers asked. Did the Navy seize Tesla's papers after his death? Why? They demanded. Did the Office of Naval Research examine Jessup's annotated book at all, if the letters were nothing but nonsense? Why? They whispered. Are so many records from wartime incomplete, entire days missing from logs, names erased from rosters? In truth, the gaps could be explained by bureaucracy, by the chaos of war, by nothing more sinister than clerical error. But in the imagination of those who sought answers, those blank spaces became doorways. The Navy's official line was blunt. There was no invisibility project. No teleportation. The Eldridge never vanished. In 1999, when the legend surged once more in popular culture, they even issued a formal statement. The ship could not have been in Philadelphia in October 1943. Records prove she was elsewhere. And yet, records prove only what is written down. What of the things never committed to paper? What of the experiments classified so high that they remain buried even decades later? Here lies the paradox. The more the Navy denied, the stronger the myth became. Denial is gasoline on the fire of mystery. Each dismissal was taken not as truth, but as evidence of deeper secrecy. There were small oddities that did not help their case. The Navy really did experiment with electromagnetic fields, though only for degaussing. The Navy really did work on radar camouflage, cloaking ships not from the eye but from radar screens. They really did seize Tesla's papers. They really did study Einstein's theories in wartime laboratories. Each of these facts was innocent in isolation, but together they resembled the outline of the very thing the Navy denied. And then there was Jessup. The astronomer's death by carbon monoxide poisoning in 1959 was ruled a suicide. He had been depressed, overwhelmed by personal troubles, his career faltering. But for those who believed, his death was too convenient. They silenced him. The whispers said, he got too close. His annotated copy of the case for the UFO, filled with Allende's scribbled claims, had been circulated among naval researchers. Why would they study it if it was nonsense? The silence around Jessup became louder than his words. For every skeptic, there was a believer with a counterpoint. For every hole in the story, a new patch of rumor. The Eldridge was said to have been sold to the Greek Navy in the 1950s, renamed HS Leon. Even then, Greek sailors whispered of strange malfunctions, of a ship that seemed haunted. Some claimed the vessel carried its curse across the Atlantic, invisible still, even under a new flag. Was any of it true? Likely not. But by the time documents were declassified, the Philadelphia experiment had grown beyond fact. It had become a mirror reflecting not what was, but what people feared might be. And in that mirror lay a deeper truth. That secrecy breeds suspicion, that silence creates ghosts. The Philadelphia experiment endures not because the Navy hid proof, but because the Navy's silence allowed imagination to take the helm. In the blank spaces of history, stories grow. And once a story grows large enough, no archive, no denial, no stack of official papers can sink it. In the end, perhaps it doesn't matter whether the Eldridge vanished in 1943. What matters is that people believed she could. What matters is that a ship became a legend, and that legend has never docked. Chapter 12. The Ship That Never Left. The USS Eldridge should have been forgotten. She was a destroyer escort, one of hundreds built during the Second World War, designed not for glory, but for necessity. She escorted convoys across the Atlantic, guarded merchant ships from the silent predators of the deep, and performed her duty like so many of her sisters. By 1945, when the guns fell silent, she had served without distinction. No great battles, no dramatic victories. A ship among ships. In 1951, the Eldridge was decommissioned, her gray hull left to rust in reserve fleets, the ghosts of war gathering in her empty passageways. A few years later, in 1955, she was transferred to Greece under the Mutual Defense Assistance Program, reborn as the HS Leon. She sailed under the blue and white flag of another navy, carrying young Greek sailors who knew little, if anything, of the whispers that clung to her steel. But whispers travel. Even in Greece, tales spread of ship's strangeness. Sailors joked nervously that she was cursed. Some claimed her equipment malfunctioned without reason, that compasses spun, that radios bled static. A few swore they saw shadows where no man stood, or lights flickering in empty corridors. Was it truth, or just sailors retelling an American legend they had heard in passing? It didn't matter. The name Eldridge carried a weight that the name Leon could not erase. In 1992, after decades of service, she was finally decommissioned once more and sold for scrap. Her hull was broken apart, her steel melted down, her parts scattered. To most, that was the end of the story. The ship was gone, recycled into the skeleton of other machines, other structures, her physical body erased. And yet, legends are never dismantled so easily. Ask around today, and you will find her still. In late-night radio shows, where callers whisper that the Navy cracked open the fabric of reality. In books stacked high in conspiracy shops, their covers plastered with glowing green ships and shadowy men. In online forums where the tale is retold, reimagined, and debated endlessly. Some insist the experiment was real, but the Navy buried it. Others claim the Eldridge was only the beginning, that the technology was refined, perfected, and hidden away, used in secret projects like Montauk or even Area 51. A few go further still, insisting that the experiment did not merely make a ship invisible, but tore open a doorway into another dimension, one that never fully closed. And if you walk along the Delaware River today, where the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard once roared with the sound of hammers and welding torches, you might hear the whispers too. Locals will tell you about the ship that vanished. Some swear their grandfathers saw it. Others laugh it off as nonsense. But when night falls and the river grows still, the story hangs in the air like mist. Because the Philadelphia experiment was never really about steel and circuits. It was about fear, about possibility, about the thin line between science and magic. It was about men caught in forces they could not comprehend, and governments willing to gamble with those men's lives in pursuit of victory. That is why the story refuses to die. It is not the fate of the Eldridge that haunts us, but what she represents, the idea that behind the walls of power Experiments are carried out not for humanity's benefit, but in spite of it. That in times of war, the line between innovation and atrocity is thin. That we are never told the whole truth. And so, the Eldridge has never truly left. She sails still, not on water, but in imagination. Her decks echo in books and films. Her green glow flickers in the dreams of those who cannot resist wondering, what if it was real? Close your eyes, just for a moment, and listen. Do you hear it? The low hum of machinery, the crackle of electricity, the rising taste of ozone at the back of your tongue. A ship trembling as coils roar to life. Sailors clutching rails, praying. A flash of light, and then emptiness. The ship is gone. Only the river remains. But if you wait long enough, perhaps you'll see her again.